Welcome to Grinding the Data. My name is Kevin Scott. I'm excited to welcome you into the podcast today. We continue our expert series with the second of our experts, Heath Cummings. Welcome, Heath.
Hey, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Heath and I have become friends this year. It's been an honor to get to know you. He's a great guy. I look forward to when we can actually hang out in person, but this is the closest we've gotten so far. So Heath writes and does all sorts of other stuff for CBS. Has stated in writing that he intends to get me a job there with him very soon. So that's very kind of him. And I'm holding on to that piece of paper. But I value Heath's opinions and intuitions as a player. I got to see his skill set firsthand this season. We did a team together in the Football Guys Championship. And, saw things the same way almost all the time. Occasionally, Heath would have a take that really challenged me, my assumptions, or showed me something from a different angle. I think he's a really good thinker. Obviously, if you've read his stuff over at CBS, he's a really good thinker and knows his stuff. So thank you for coming on, Heath.
Yeah, I think my biggest regrets, because we drafted a good team and we got off to a great start. Everything went great. I think there were two mistakes that we made, and one of them was a guy that I wanted to take, and one of them was a guy that you wanted to take. And for me, at least the memory I have, I don't know how you recall it, but it was Mark Andrews and it was Elijah Moore. Because I think that there was definitely a period of time where I was like, man, I wish we had Elijah Moore. And I know we took Allen Robinson in round 3, which at the time I thought was a really good pick. It was definitely my idea, but I wish we had taken Andrews instead of Allen Robinson, obviously.
Yeah. And I mean, Andrews at that point was sometimes going to the 5th, so it was hard to take him in the 3rd, but we were really hoping for him in the 4th. Didn't quite work out. I thought you were going to say Juju Smith-Schuster was your mistake.
Oh, good grief. Yes, that was. I talked you into that one.
Yeah, but there were some that I picked that were bad too. So yeah, but we had a great team. If Henry didn't get hurt, I think we had a shot, but it is what it is. It was one of those seasons. I was going to start with, you were just telling me before we started that, you were working on all your projections and dynasty charts and all that stuff. And, you're one of the guys that we'll have on that does the most with ranking and projecting, both preseason and in season. And so I just wanted to start there. I think that, being able to project and, rank players effectively is one of the best skills that somebody can have in fantasy. So I just wanted to see, if you can explain a little bit about your process, how you do projections from like a season-long perspective, maybe, and then also week to week. How does that work for you?
There are a lot of similarities. The way that I do it, there's lots of different people who do it in different ways, but the way I found that works best with my brain is I start everything on a team level. As I said, in a couple of weeks, I'll start building it out for next year. One of the things that's kind of caused me to delay is this time last year, 5 of the 7 head coaching vacancies had already been filled. Now we've got 0 of 8. And that is part of what goes into my projections, because I'll start off on the team level with what are the play calling tendencies from the coaching staff in the past. And that will help me determine the number of plays, the number of pass plays, the number of rush plays, and then how have they scored? Because there are teams who will be more pass heavy between the 20s, and then they'll go less pass heavy in the red zone, or vice versa. We've seen that with Arizona, where they've really kind of struggled to throw the ball into the end zone unless DeAndre Hopkins is on the field. So I start with those tendencies, and then I will build out the rosters as we're projecting them. It's tough this time of year. I'll be adding guys all throughout free agency and the draft, leaning on their historical efficiency, but not too much. I try to normalize just because I know a lot of that stuff's not too predictive. But if you've got a guy who's at 11 yards per target last year, I don't want to rank him at 8 like everybody else, or project him at 8 like everybody else. So I kind of view the projections as what should we expect to happen based on what has happened in the past. And then the rankings, I move more into what do I think is going to be different. But the projections give me that baseline. And I think if I've made a mistake with that in the past, it's maybe leaning a little bit too much on the projections, especially outside of the top, say 25 at running back or 25 at wide receiver, because you get past that and what they're projected for doesn't really matter. It's what if they get the opportunity, what could they be? And I missed that a little bit earlier in my career by leaning on projections so much later in the draft, the ranking process.
Right. That's interesting. It does make such a difference. If you get a head coach who's an offensive guy who has a certain history, I mean, that's going to totally change projections. One thing I struggle with is I'll do the projections. I'll feel really good about it. And then, a guy gets cut, they sign a new guy, or the rookie class completely messes it up. So I try to even wait till after the draft to even start, because I get so sick of going back in and modifying everything. I guess that's just what you do, right?
Well, it is, and that's one of the weird things about my brain, I think, is I probably enjoy that week of building projections and the week after free agency when I'm putting all the players in place, and then the week after the draft, like doing that process and building it is really the fun part for me.
Yeah.
I would say it's the fun part in season 2, except the problem is that I have to do what I do in a week every Monday,
Right,
and
right.
that's not very fun at all.
So how does that work then? I mean, I totally get the annual. I've never done projections week to week. I remember me saying like, "Well, who do you want to start?" And you would say, "Well, I got this guy projected for 10.9 and this guy for 10.6." And I'm like, "How?" I mean, I know that you're just picking like sort of like extrapolating out from the season long to a degree to, I don't know if that's the right word, but stripping it into 1 week. But how does that work from 1 week to 1 week?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from those season-long projections, especially the first month of the season, because
Hmm.
what a guy did in week 1 doesn't tell us much about week 2. I'm still leaning on what I thought was going to happen for the year for the most part. But usage and stuff like that, I will update during the week. And then probably the biggest change is that I don't like touchdowns very much, which is a weird thing to say for someone who plays fantasy football and writes about it, because it's the most important part, but it's also the least predictive part.
Hmm.
It's guys are much more accurate at projecting targets, projecting catches, projecting yards, those types of things than projecting touchdowns, because they're such rare events. And
Right.
so for scoring in season, I really lean on Vegas projections
Oh, okay.
and implied totals. And so like the Chiefs every week have 28, 29, 30 implied points. And I try to spread those out in terms of touchdowns amongst the team.
Oh, by percentage. That's interesting. Yeah,
Right.
I've never thought about implied points impacting your weekly projections. That makes sense. So,
And I would be very open to having a better way to project scoring. It's just that's the way I've found that's the most accurate, and kind of from I'm not someone who's had a lot of success betting team over and under. So I'm going to lean
right.
on what the guys that are making money betting are doing on that.
Yeah, and I guess I think as far as week to week in a DFS way, like I look at matchups.
Mhm.
With the Chiefs example, who's going to be guarding Tyreek? Are they going to have a guy on him? Are they going to play a zone or a safety over the top, or is that going to leave Hardman against a crappy? You know what I mean? So
Right.
that's more of like my method. I'm not awesome at DFS though, so.
Right. I factor that in a little bit, but I think like we saw it this year. There was such a change around the midway point in the way that teams were defending quarterbacks, and we
Hmm.
saw quarterback stats just fall through the floor. We saw Mahomes had the 4 or 5 or 6 week stretch where he's averaging 6.5 yards per attempt, and the defense just wouldn't give him anything deep until they showed that they could beat that defense. And so it's really tough for me on a week to week basis looking at those matchups. I can guess what the opposing defense is going to do. And for
Yeah.
those 4 or 5 weeks, it was pretty easy to guess what defense we're
Right.
going to do against the Chiefs.
Yep.
But that's tough on a week to week basis.
Yeah, I'm with you. Cool. So for our listeners, maybe who haven't ever done projections or rankings, you said you always start with the team. What would you say is the best way for them to kind of tiptoe into that? Would you say look at the stats from last season and kind of build it off of that, or how would they get started with a team from a team perspective?
Yeah, I think this kind of gets me into trouble a little bit, but I generally will use for play callers, especially a 3 year window. And for most players, if they've got a 3 year window over the past 3 years, I will use that when looking at efficiency, because I think people forget just how small of a sample size 17 games is.
Hmm.
And that probably comes into my head more because I used to do baseball as well. And 17 games was like a tenth of the season. It didn't mean
Right.
anything at all. So I generally try to look at a 3 year window if I can. And again, I generally try to normalize a little bit the super outliers. And there's times when that really works. The Titans have been an example of a time when that has not worked, because every year they're bottom 3 or 4 in pass attempts. And you generally regress those guys a little bit more towards average. And then the next year they are bottom 3 or 4 in pass attempts again. So
Right.
it's not always right. But those are the two things I would say is get as big a sample size as you can. And then if you want to lean, like sometimes you need to look at the last 4 games or you need to look at the last 8 games. and like influence the projections in that way. But for me, there needs to be a good story as to why,
Okay.
because there is a lot of variance in this game, and there definitely is. There's recency bias for sure. But if something changed 5 games ago, then you probably need to, and you expect it to be the same moving forward, then you probably need to weight that more heavily.
Right. Cool. So you, I guess, do you anticipate based on this season? For me, I don't know about if you feel this way, but for me, this was a very weird season, difficult season, one of my toughest. And I'm going to go back and study, why I didn't have the results I normally do.
Mhm.
But I think the main thing I care about is does my process need to change for next season, or does it? And kind of really
Right.
studying that. And when you think about that for yourself, do you see any changes about how you rank and project players, or do you think I did a pretty good job there?
Um, Projections wise, I've not really found any areas where I'm intending on making changes, but I'm really early in the process, obviously, so that could change. Rankings wise, definitely. One of them I mentioned earlier. I'm going to be much more diligent about kind of disregarding the projections once you get deeper into the rankings and just ranking more on what I think potential upside is and not what I think the most likely outcome is. I think the most likely outcome is still helpful for the first maybe 5 rounds of the draft, maybe 3 or 4 rounds of the draft. But after that, I'll lean a lot more on upside than I did this past year.
Interesting.
I
So
think
more than
Go ahead.
floor, more upside than floor.
For later round picks, I will, yes. For
Hmm.
early round picks, I probably lean a little bit more towards floor or projectable outcome.
Hmm.
This is just kind of a random one-off, and I don't know if you feel this way, but I think one of the things that messed me up as much as anything was caring about things that happened in the preseason.
Mm.
Like you think back to some of the big storylines from the preseason. Jamar Chase can't catch the ball because it's a different kind of football. And now the DeAndre Swift one's difficult because originally it was DeAndre Swift's not going to have a full workload, and then he was awesome for the first half of the year, but then he got hurt again. So maybe
Right.
that one actually did. But there were definitely some things that happened in the preseason that I think maybe I placed a little bit too much weight on, and I
Yeah.
just like to ignore some of that as well. I think of probably like you tried to get me to draft a team, I think in June or July. And I said, man, I don't like to do that until we get close to the end of the preseason. And I might have done better if we had
Right.
drafted in June or July this year.
Yeah, my best football guys team was from like June 15th. And it's because I do think that's true. You change, and it's sort of like I was talking with Abib the other day, the groupthink seeps in, right? You hear all this
Mhm.
stuff on Twitter, and like whether it's flashing in preseason or just people excited about a guy, and then all of a sudden he seeps or starts to move up your rankings a little bit, or he's in your mind. And there's some guys that I wish that had happened with, right? Like Debo. I mean, I had almost no Debo because I
Right.
just it's Ayuk's team, blah 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 in my head. And sometimes you have to have your narrative challenge, but yeah, I think that I do think if you stick with, you're ranking now, you're projecting now or soon. So if you stick with what you've got for the most part, I do think that's a solid strategy compared to letting any of that stuff affect you. Um, but yeah, I guess you can see it both ways, right? I mean,
For sure.
yeah. What do you think as far as draft? I mean, obviously when we drafted, I can't remember. I think we took 2 backs to start, and there's lots of different strategies that can work. What do you anticipate, kind of for yourself, or as you're talking and encouraging other people for their 2022 drafts? What do you think is maybe the most effective potentially draft strategy? I know that you can win any way, but where are you going to lean? Are you going to lean heavy RB still, or zero RB, or all these different ideas?
It's so funny because I did a bit on our podcast 2 or 3 years ago about this and had coined my own new strategy that was called NIPS. It was no intentional positional strategy because
Okay.
when I draft with the CBS guys, I am kind of the zero RB guy
Hmm.
and Dave Richard even jokes that his goal for this year is to draft a wide receiver in the first round once. It's just it gets 9, 10 running backs in the first round of every draft, and so I always end up with Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill or whatever to
Hmm.
start. Um, I I really have a hard time with saying I like this strategy because you don't. It depends so much on who you're drafting with
Right.
and what they're going to do. But I do think like we went running back heavy. I didn't have a lot of teams where I did that this year. Um, I think it leans a little bit more towards the hero running back or the zero running back, but again, you look
It
at
depends on your group.
right, the teams that had top 5 picks and said, well, I'm going to take a running back and I'm going to take 2 wide receivers at the 2-3 turn. A lot
It's
of
brutal.
times ended up with something like Christian McCaffrey and AJ Brown and Calvin Ridley. And it's just like, good
I had so
night.
many teams with McCaffrey and Brown, man. It's absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, and, you can be in, like, the same exact draft spot, like, let's say you get 10th, and if it's 9 backs in a row, you're certainly going with a receiver, and if it's there were a lot of football guys championships drafts where a ton of people wanted to go 0 RB, so you had 6 receivers in the top 10, and then it becomes much more, getting Henry at 9 or 10 becomes a lot more palatable, so,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
yeah, and, I guess I think from a perspective of, in a vacuum, like you have, let's say a draft goes according to ADP, or what we anticipate ADP being. Are there any of those strategies that you think, that one has a potential to win big in a big contest? Like we were in this football guys championship contest. Is there one that you think is most likely to be the most effective or not?
I generally think the one that is most likely to be effective at winning the big contest is the one that's least popular that year.
Hmm.
Like there was a couple years ago where we had all of the 0 RB is dead articles, and I thought that was a pretty good time in the big contest to go 0 RB if nobody else wants to do it.
Okay, just be contrarian.
But I also think the more high upside wide receivers you can build around, and if I can get 4 high upside wide receivers and an elite tight end, and then you hit the running back waiver wire lottery, I think that's the easiest path to just have a monster team that no
Right.
one can compete with. Now, the thing that was unique about this year is 2 of those wide receivers, if you're going to hit on that strategy, would have been like 5th and 9th round picks
Right.
in Cooper Kupp and Deebo Samuel. That's not the way we generally think of it working out, but I think that's probably more of an anomaly than not something I'm going to plan on happening next year.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Um, yeah, I think that the receiver strategy, I agree, it gives you the most upside. I think the only reason that it's not the same for running backs, hitting on those stud running backs is just you got the injuries, of course, but then it just seems like you can hit so many of those, backups that turn into studs, and that's just
Well,
not
and
the
it's
case with
injuries.
receivers. Yeah, injuries
Like
and
we hit on Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, DeAndre Swift, and Michael Carter.
yeah,
That team should have been a monster.
right.
And at one point in the season, I think we had one guy out of the
Yeah,
4 of them.
it's true. Yeah. So, but I guess that's the flip side is that if you don't draft a bunch of them and give yourself options, then you're kind
Right.
of toast. So yeah, it's a hard game, hard game. How about statistical shifts? Have you seen anything like with the output when you look back at the scoring that you think that's going to lead to like a new draft or roster construction for me, or is it just kind of the same thing like you're saying, build depth everywhere that you can?
I think the most interesting shift is one that I've not yet figured out how to process. So it's maybe not a good answer to this question, but I do think what happened in the middle of the year with quarterback scoring,
Hmm.
and kind of the return of the pocket passers to the top 10 quarterbacks. I'm not sure I'm ready to call that a new trend that's going to change draft strategy, but it's definitely something that we have to keep an eye on for next year. If like in where all of our leagues at CBS are 6 points per pass touchdown, so I'll use those numbers. But we had kind of gotten to the point where we thought after last year that you needed to be 25 fantasy points a game to be a good starting quarterback. And this year that dropped back down to the 22-point range. And in
Hmm.
the second half, it was a lot worse than that. So if that happens, then I think because I had kind of gotten to the point where we had like 7 guys who had so much more upside than everyone else. And most of them didn't show it this year.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not the case, then we might be back to the point to why there's no reason to take any quarterbacks even kind of early.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because one of the things I thought of mid-year was that my general strategy has been late quarterback,
Uh-huh.
especially because you got guys like Fields that this year I was excited about, and these rookies are all the guys that run that maybe aren't in the top 10. You could have got guys like Burrow in the 12th plus round in some of those leagues. So I've always tended that way, but about halfway through the year, I thought, man, if you did not take one of those guys it felt, because the quarterbacks
Oh,
were so bad in scoring, it felt like you can't compete.
well, I think it was that way at the beginning at the midway point in the year, but then Josh Allen had a 4-week stretch where he
True.
wasn't that
Yeah.
good, and Kyler Murray fell apart, and Lamar Jackson got hurt,
Yeah.
and so then it was like, well, nobody's any good.
Yeah. And it felt the same way with tight end, didn't it? I mean, you got
Yeah.
Kittle doing nothing. I mean, Kelsey was good, but not great. Andrews was the only one that like really outproduced, what we thought he would.
Right, yeah, and then poor Kyle Pitts, if he could only scored touchdowns, it
Yeah.
would have been a fantastic
Do you think
buy.
anything with that, like with tight ends, do you still feel the same about your strategy, or do you think, I need to get one of the top guys, or I just wait? What are you feeling with that at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's good evidence for the weight approach from this year because what we saw with Dawson Knox and Dalton Schultz.
Hmm.
But again, it's one of those things that I don't feel very confident that it's going to last. And I still I think Pitts is in that elite tier already. He just didn't score the touchdowns this year, but he will next year. And so I'm like maybe it's changed a little bit because I don't feel as comfortable with Kittle and Waller at the 2-3 turn in a regular league or in the second round of a FFPC type draft, but
Hmm.
I still would really like to have one of those 5. I don't think tight end's a very easy position most seasons to stream
Yeah.
because you're going back to that same thing of there's not very many guys you stream at tight end who put up 6 for 70 and get you 13 points that way.
Right.
Will this guy score a touchdown this week?
Yeah. It's so tough. I mean, that's why Dalton Schultz was money, because he got the
Yep.
volume. Yeah. So when you look back at this season, what do you think most of the championship teams? This is a question I asked Abib too. If you had to say like this is a reason, maybe it's a CBS local league, maybe it's a big league in a big contest. Why do you think they won? I mean, was it a great draft, or with all the injuries and the craziness, maybe that it was more just good luck with injury and COVID stuff, or great waiver wires, or what do you think was the main factor?
They drafted Cooper Kupp and Debo Samuel and Mark Andrews. Like the outliers were such outliers
They
this
were.
year. So I think that's a lot of it. I also think like this year and last year, luck's always heavily involved in this game. Like we know
Hmm.
that. It's been more so the last 2 years, and I feel pretty strongly that that's going to go back to more normal next year.
Hmm.
Just because I think we've gotten to the point where professional leagues are just not going to have guys sitting out for COVID after this year, probably.
Right.
They're just going to play, and
Hmm.
so I think a lot of that type of stuff is probably going to go away. But it was like winning this year really came down to did you have one of those 3 or 4 stats? I think I had like just on my regular leagues, I had 4 or 5 teams that won the championship. Every
Wow.
single team I had that won the championship was a Mark Andrews team.
Oh wow.
It
And
was
you were high on him, so you
right.
got rewarded for that. That's good.
Right, but I mean, I was high on Lamar Jackson too, and that didn't work out quite so well. So
Yeah, yeah, and that was really. I mean, I was very high in Cup. I had a ton of Cup, so that
right,
was great. But at the same time, zero Debo, and almost no Andrew. So yeah, it was. And then if you get some injuries, yeah, it's easy to go sideways. I do think more than in years past, that hitting on those guys was more important,
yep,
than hitting on the top scorers in years past, and it's probably just because those guys went so late, right?
exactly. And I think that might be one of the reasons where I was saying like those guys after those first 4 or 5 rounds, it might be that the thing we should really think about is just who can be those guys
Right.
and not who's going
Exactly.
to give you the floor.
Right, and that's why, like, Elijah Moore, that was
Mhm.
my guy that I wanted, but I think it's a matter of hitting on those guys. You're gonna miss a lot, when you go for upside in the middle late rounds, but
Yep.
I agree with you. I think if you hit a hard enough on it, hit enough guys that you think have upside, you're gonna hit on a couple, and that can be the difference. Yeah, that's good. As you think about building rosters, I just was curious about your take. Do you think when you go into a draft, like I really want to come out of this draft super deep in the middle, running back, receiver, and obviously have a great tight end too? Or do you think I want to build my starting lineup first and have an awesome starting lineup, including your quarterback, tight end, and then start to build depth? Just how do you think about strategically?
This is more of a mid-draft decision for me, and it goes back to what we talked about with the Like, I don't know how the draft's going to go the first 3 or 4 rounds and what everybody else is going to do.
Right.
But one of the reasons I like having a great tight end is I don't have to think about that position anymore.
Mhm.
My general approach is I'd like to just have a quarterback and a tight end and about 17 running backs and wide receivers is kind of
Mhm.
the way I approach it. But it might be that I started off with 4 wide receivers my first 5 picks, and I just don't take another one because I'm really thin at running back. And so my last 6 picks are all going to be upside running backs. Or if it was like our draft where we started off with 4 running backs in our first 5 or 6 picks, then I might not take another running back after that. And I'm just going to draft a ton of wide receivers. I'm going to focus on upside in the second half of the draft, but positionally it's going to be about where I'm thin and just get as many of them as I can and really kind of go overboard on it.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm in a mix of leagues where some are these contests and some are contained leagues, and I found that in the contests I really have to build depth and leave the quarterback and tight end if I can for a little bit later
Yeah,
because of all the injuries, and you start so many players. But in thinner leagues, I feel like I have to build the starting lineup primarily first. Obviously, I don't have to take quarterback in the first 6 rounds, but yeah, I just was curious about if you have a general strategy. And what I hear you
well,
saying with all these things is just how it falls, right? How the draft
but
falls.
I do think like bringing up those different types of leagues because it's good for us to remember that a lot of the people who are listening are playing in home leagues
Hmm.
and are the most prepared person in their league.
Right.
And I do think in those leagues, I am willing to take a quarterback earlier. I am willing to take one of the elite tight ends earlier because I'm confident that my league mates are going to leave me a lot
Right.
of guys that I
Exactly.
want to draft later at the other positions.
Yep, and I
So,
think that's partly one of the mistakes I've made in my like high dollar leagues is thinking that they're onto the same guys I'm onto,
right.
and then I got to snap up, Devonta Smith, Elijah Moore, these young guys I like, or up high upside, and then I miss on getting a good quarterback or tight end. And the truth is, those guys a lot of times those guys are still there in the 12th, 13th round. People aren't always on the same guys you're on, so.
For sure.
Yeah, just kind of interesting strategy there. How about how about with blind bidding? I know we did blind bidding together in our league, and most leagues are moving toward blind bidding these days. How do you approach the blind bidding strategy as far as spending up big to try to get the players on your roster for as long as possible, or saving budget so that you can have a lot at the end? How do you think about that?
I really think the best approach is to be aggressive, and it can lead to some just absolutely hilarious mistakes in the first few weeks of the season. But there's only so many potential league winners that are going to come around, and you don't know. There's no formula for when those guys are going to happen. So, week 1, week 2, if somebody pops up, Elijah Mitchell, that you think, or Cordero Patterson for half the season, that you
Right,
think this guy could be a league winner, I think you got to go get him.
right,
And everything we'll worry about the future in the future. Now it's different in leagues that don't have $0 bids because then
right,
I got into that situation with one where I was in the semifinals this year and I didn't have any money. I literally could not add a player.
right. Me too.
Um, so that's no fun. And I would encourage commissioners to just not have leagues that don't allow $0 bids.
Right.
But if you're in one of those, then you have to handle it a little bit differently. But for the most part, I think you need to shoot the moon. You need to just like if you see a guy and you think he's a potential league winner, go get him.
So Elijah Mitchell for you, I mean, looking back, let's say that you had a roster where you could really use him. And, obviously we didn't know if that was going to last. We thought, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
one of these other guys works in, you got all these options in San Francisco, and you never know what Shanahan's going to do. But let's say you were convinced that, hey, this guy, I really think he'd be a league winner. You got $1,000. What are you spending?
The Mitchell one, like I'm going to try to just take the fact that it was the 49ers and they had 17 other running backs out of the equation because that
Right.
was what complicated
Yeah.
for me, and I only got him in a couple leagues. But I don't think you should hesitate to go 600 or 700.
Okay. Yeah.
That
70%.
was my most successful team. I think it was the first year maybe that I was playing in a contest like that, and it was Cam Newton's rookie year, and I shot the moon on him after the first week. And when I say shot the moon, I didn't play 100%, so that's not quite an accurate term, I guess. But I just went all in on him after the first week, and it was absolutely the right call.
Right.
there's a couple of those guys every year. And like I said, you have to just put the fear aside, because you're going to miss sometimes and spend the whole year thinking, well, I blew my whole fab on a guy I just dropped. But
Right.
the reward is worth the risk.
Yeah, one thing I've learned is also I gotta I'm in agreement. You gotta go for it if you think a guy can be a difference maker. One mistake I continue to make year to year that I'm going to work on is a guy goes down in the preseason. For example, J.K. Dobbins this season, and I thought, oh, this Ravens back they're talking up. Honestly, I can't even remember his name. What's his name?
Was it Tyson?
Yes, Tyson Williams. Oh, he's gonna be the guy. He's gonna just take over the role. And I spent way too much of fab to get him. And one thing that I kind of take from that is I want to wait until the season starts and I see a
Yeah,
guy really produce, in a game before I put serious money on him. And that's what was different about Mitchell. Like you just, wow, he's great out there. He's playing ahead of Sermon, right? Like
right.
it's all just chatter in the preseason, but then you see it actually happen, and then okay, I can drop my money on this guy.
For sure.
Yeah. So how about learnings? I mean, we've talked a little bit about that already, but what would you say is like you look back at this season or maybe the past few seasons? What would be one or two of the most important things you've learned or ways that you're going to grow your own game? It could be from an analyst perspective too, how you're going to grow as an analyst or what's changed for you.
I think I've made, and the projections process leans towards this a little bit, but I need to be a little bit more skeptical of guys who are just guys simply because of the volume. And I'm thinking of the Mike Davises, the Miles Gaskins, the
Right.
guys in that range. Mitchell was a different story because the profile was just a guy, but he was in Kyle Shanahan's system, and Kyle Shanahan always turns just a guys into superstar running backs, at least for a couple of weeks at a time.
Right.
But I think those guys who there's nothing special about them as players, and there's nothing special about their offense, and you're just drafting them or ranking them where they are because there's nobody else that's going to take it from them.
Yeah,
Well,
good point.
it might be that Cordero Patterson takes it from them, or Duke Johnson takes it from them, or
Exactly.
Malcolm Brown steals touchdowns. Those types of guys, I'm going to be more skeptical of in the future.
That's great. Yeah, Mike Davis, that hurts. Yeah, I took him in a few. I remember sending a draft to you. This is funny. This is right before we drafted, and I said, "What do you think of this draft?" And you said something along the lines of, "That's pretty much a perfect draft." And and it had, I mean, I had Mahomes in the fourth and Andrews in the fifth. There were some good parts of it,
Right.
but man, Mike Davis was in the sixth, and he was my second running back, and that team just never got going.
Right.
So yeah, that's a really good, and that kind of is similar to the whole debate about draft for anticipated touches or draft for talent, and
Right.
it's really hard. Most of us aren't scouts. We don't know how to watch the tape and really tell what a guy's going to do, and it's also different from college to pro. But yeah, I think I that's something I continue to learn again and again. Is always go with talent as much as you can tell if a guy's talented. Yeah.
Or maybe we should just add a third leg, and it's the quality of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have any reason to believe the Dolphins or the Falcons were going to be real good offenses this year.
That's true.
So maybe if the situation can overcome some of the talent, if they have the situation and the opportunity, then we'll not worry about the talent as much. But they got to have at least two of the three, and if they have three of the three, then obviously they're a star.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like it. Well, let's kind of close out with one more thing. I asked Abib the same question. I guess if you zoom out and think about fantasy football from a really wide lens, all the things that can make you a successful player, what's if a listener was here with us and they could ask a question like, Heath, hey, what's one thing I can do? I'm pretty good. I'm fine. I finished middle of the pack in my home league. I want to get better, or I want to start playing in these big contests and I want to be successful. What's one thing you would suggest they do?
I think you have to become a little bit better at learning what to learn from. You almost have to have a short and a long memory, because like I talked about with the sample sizes, you need to be able to look back and recall, like, okay, this 4-game stretch is great, but is there a reason that it's happening? But also, like, one of the biggest mistakes I hear people make, and they did it with Joe Mixon coming into this year. No, I drafted Joe Mixon in the second round, and that did not work out last year. And so I'm not going to do that again. Well, the situation was different. Don't hold bad seasons from high pedigree players in the past against them. And Joe Mixon never actually had a bad season. He just didn't live up to the expectations the fantasy football community put on him for the first couple of years. But that is a huge mistake when people say, no, this guy did this in the past when I drafted him, and so I'm not going to draft him again.
Yeah, that's good. And then as they're working on their rankings and everything, they should go to CBS and look at your rankings. That could make them a great player, right?
Well, I think that hits on another point, though, is you need to find people whose opinions that you value, and don't be afraid to listen to them.
Yeah, lean into
Not
that.
exclusively,
Mhm.
but you don't be afraid to let somebody else influence you, as long as it's the small group of people that you've decided you value their opinions.
Yeah, that's good. Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Heath, for coming on, and I appreciate your thoughts and your time. I'm sure that the listeners are going to really enjoy hearing from you. And if you're not following Heath on Twitter yet, you should. He's at Heath Cummings SR, right? Heath
That's
Cummings
right.
Senior, right? And he does a lot of great stuff on there. In your any other place you want to point them to? Just CBS Sports.
Yeah, CBSSports.com right now is the best place, because you can find the podcast there. You can find, again, we've got dynasty rankings, dynasty tiers, dynasty trade chart, everything coming out this week. So if you're thinking about your dynasty league, that's the place to go.
Very cool. Yeah, I will definitely check that out. As we close, let me just ask that if you're listening, you do two things to help this podcast continue to go. Just spread the word by reviewing it. That'd be awesome over on Apple Podcasts, especially. Tell people about it, put it on Twitter, and then you can support the podcast over at Anchor. Thank you again, Heath, for coming on. I hope this was helpful to everyone, and we will see you next time.